all to you.
All right, hopefully I'll locate and push the right buttons here.
Okay, while you're doing that, I'm going to allow Tom to talk because I think he has something to say to you. Go ahead, Tom, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Hey, Keith, Tom Mullen here, President of THS. How are you, my friend?
Doing all right, Tom. Yourself?
I'm doing good, thank you.
Good.
Hey, Keith, I just wanted to take a quick minute and thank you for all you've done personally and Cummins Engine for everything you guys have done and are going to do for us in the future, building a relationship and keeping the history of Cummins Engine and the American trucking industry alive. So, Keith, I salute you, my friend. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your program today.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Quite an introduction there. So I guess I'll try to get started with it here. Good afternoon to everybody. Glad to be here. Wish it could be under better circumstances, but we'll take advantage of our amazing communication technology to make this work, right? Thanks again to Leanne and Tom and everybody at ATHS for this opportunity today. Just push the button here. My slide is not moving. Oh, good. We've got the first breakdown in the process here already. Okay. As some of you may recall, we marked our centennial in business last year. And one of the things that really struck me the most about all of the run up to the several events that we had was the tremendous support and enthusiasm that we got from ATHS. So once again, on behalf of myself and the dozen or so guys that make our History and Restoration Center go, we just want to say thanks again. And I certainly hope we can find some way to return the favor next year when ATHS turns 50. On the other hand, doing this today downstream of those events puts me in the difficult position of trying to follow Dick Calloway's act. I refer, of course, to the excellent articles that Mr. Calloway penned that appeared last fall in Wheels of Time. Those were really terrific pieces of work, and so I'm now going to try to tell some of that same story in the wake of Dick's terrific work, and can only hope it goes halfway as good as his did. 100 years again is way too much to try to talk about in less than an hour. So what I'm going to do today is we'll go back to the beginning and just work our way up through the initial years leading to the two principal engine lines that the company finally found itself with in the 30s, that then led on to a great many terrific things in the years that followed. And one of those two lines was, of course, the H. And this image that you see in front of you was something that we found by the early 80s that the H had really made the company. And so we liked it so much that we did this. This thing is a 1983 Big Cam 3, and everything in it, from the block and the crank to hoses and gaskets and seals, is all suspended on wires and arranged like an exploded parts book drawing. This is on display in the lobby of our corporate office building in downtown Columbus, Indiana. That lobby is open to the public just about all the time. So if you have the opportunity to come visit us in Columbus, make sure to drop in and have a look at this thing, because it's quite a remarkable sight, to be sure. Well, there he is, my friends, Clessie Lyle Cummins, the father of the automotive diesel. He was just over 30 years of age when he established the engine company. Clessie preferred to be called CL, and so I'm going to attempt to honor that by using that expression whenever I can, although I have a tendency to fall into the familiar Clessie as though I met the man, which obviously I never did. But in any event, CL was born in 1888, and if you know your Indiana geography at all, draw a line in your mind's eye there from Anderson to Muncie to Newcastle and back to Anderson. And right in the middle of that triangle is the farm where CL came into this world. As a youngster with his family, he moved frequently. They lived in 6 or 8 different places I think, within, his first 10 to 12 years of life. The reason for this was that his dad was engaged in making hoops for barrels. And they made those out of elm. And the practicality and the economics of it was such that when they exhausted a stand of elm trees, it made more sense to pick up the whole works and move it to some other stand of elm trees rather than to bring in the raw material. So they moved a great deal. But in 1904, they finally landed here in Columbus, Indiana. And Clessy was shoved into the 8th grade, so to speak. But by January of 1905, which was halfway through the school year, he decided he was done. He says in his autobiography, quote, I decided I had enough schooling. I rejected all pleas of my father and mother. I wanted to be a machinist and make things, unquote. The man with the 8th grade education, or rather, I guess I should say the half 8th grade education, since he bailed out midterm, eventually held more than 30 United States patents, all of which, save one, are related to diesel engines and diesel engine fuel systems. So he did, in fact, get started being a machinist and making things. He got a job as an apprentice machinist here in Columbus, and very shortly thereafter moved to Reeves Pulley, also here in town, then to American Motor Car in Indianapolis. Followed that with a stint at Indiana Piston Ring in Hagerstown, Indiana. That is a firm that became much better known later on as Perfect Circle. And then finally back to Indianapolis again with Marmon Motor Car. His job at Marmon, now at the age of 19, was to test new cars as they came out of the assembly process and make the decision as to whether or not the car was suitable to be sold or whether it needed to go back into the shop for some adjustment or further repair. Quite a responsibility, it strikes me, for one at the age of 19. And also sometimes he would also deliver cars to their new owners and give them some orientation about how to operate the car, because there was not much standardization on automobiles in those days. They were all a little different. And it so happens then in the fall of 1908, he happened to be spending some time with a customer in Seymour, Indiana, which is just about 20 miles south of us here in Columbus, and was familiarizing the new owner with the operation of his new Marmon. And while doing so, CL was visiting family back in Columbus as well, and his mother happened to tell him about a guy by the name of W.G. Irwin. Irwin is a rather stern-looking fellow in the upper left here. Irwin's dad had come to Columbus in 1850 and set up a general store, and was so successful that by 1871 he opened a bank, and that was followed by many other enterprises. And by this time, in the very early 1900s, WG has earned a bachelor's degree from Butler University and is managing the family's many operations. He also happens to own a brand new Packard, and he's looking for a chauffeur. Fascinating story about how CL got the job. Not enough time for it here, but in any event, he did secure this position with Mr. Irwin. Now, driving a car in those days was certainly seasonal work, owing to both the limitations of the automobile at the time and principally to the condition of the public roads. So CL had some other jobs from time to time. He worked for a while as a motorman on the electric interurban railroads. Indiana at that time had this very large network that radiated out from Indianapolis. There was a line that ran from Indianapolis to Louisville, Kentucky, and it was immediately parallel to a branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And CL figured out how to overvoltage the motors on these interurban cars in bursts so that he could outrun the passenger trains on the Pennsylvania. He also modified Irwin's Packard to put it on the rails, and got Irwin in the car, and they sailed down the railroad tracks at up to 60 miles an hour. Everything seemed fine until it came time to stop. That's when they discovered that braking was a problem, and so that project didn't go much further. He also did another stint at Reeves Pulley, again here in town, and then back to Indianapolis with Marmon once again, doing the same kind of work. However, at this time, the first Indianapolis 500-mile race was being staged, and Marmon entered a car in it, and in fact wound up being the winner of the 1911 Indy 500. CL was on the pit crew for that car, and he is pictured here at the wheel of loss. By 1914, Clessy decided to come home, and he came back to Columbus and established a firm called Cummins Machine Works, which is the immediate predecessor firm to the company that we're talking about here today. He started out in automobile repair, but was also doing some machine work, and the machining work rapidly overwhelmed the auto repair business as the Great War got underway. And the United States began to gear up for it. He secured a number of contracts from the Army, built some bits and pieces for grenades, and also hubs for the wheels on artillery pieces, not unlike the one pictured here. And but toward the end of the war, also happened to receive an order from a firm in Evansville, Indiana, called Hercules, for this little doodad picture down here at the lower right. That happens to be an injector for what was then called the oil engine. And this really piqued Clessy's interest. Needless to say, from at this point, he's had 10 years roughly experience in the automobile industry, and so he knows a great deal about the gasoline engine. When he was a kid, his dad's operations were all powered by steam, so he was quite familiar with the steam engine as well, but this oil engine was a new thing. And so he looked into this and discovered that Hercules was building engines under license from a Dane named Rasmus Veed. Mr. Veed had brought the concept to the United States with the various patents and arrangements for granting manufacturing licenses. And so Clessy paid him a visit and thought this building diesels, or oil engines as they were then known, might be a pretty good idea. Mr. Irwin agreed, and he elected to buy the license and form the Indiana Corporation that would undertake this work. The license arrangement with Veed was concluded in January of 1919, and on February 3, 1919, the Cummins Engine Company Incorporated was established here in the state of Indiana. And that little red engine pictured there was the initial product. We refer to those today as Veeds, H-V-I-D, owing to the name of the license arrangement. We don't know for certain that they were referred to in any other way at the time, other than as Cummins oil engines. But they were built in 4 different flavors: a 1.5, 3, 6, and 8 horsepower. All 4 of them have a different bore and stroke. Interestingly enough, the company started out with the 6 horsepower engine, and the power cylinder in the 6 is only very slightly smaller than the power cylinder in the N14, believe that or not. The 6 and 8 horsepower engines were sold as Cummins oil engines. You see an advertisement there in the upper left. The smaller ones were sometimes sold as Cummins oil engines, but much more frequently as Sears Thermoil. And if you see the handful that survive today, they will often have a marking on them that says Sears Thermoil. The reason for this is that CL had secured a contract with Sears Roebuck and Company. And if you're like me, you can remember the days when almost anything you could possibly want, you could buy from the Sears catalog. And in the early 20s, this happened to include the little oil engines. The Sears deal ran from about 1920 through 1922, and it came unglued owing to Sears' very generous 30-day money-back guarantee, which it turns out a great many customers took advantage of and would buy the engine, use it for a couple, 3 weeks, and then send it back. So this was certainly no way to run a business, and it almost wiped out the fledgling Cummins Engine Company right from the start. Because the company built about 2,500 of these things, and a very significant volume came back. Interestingly enough, about 40 are known to exist today. So while he was also trying to deal with the Sears contract, OCL was already at work making improvements, and his first homegrown design was the units pictured here. We refer to these today as the vertical Veed. Again, for lack of knowing any better nomenclature. As you can see, of course, Clessy's taken the horizontal kind of steam engine architecture of the original Veed and went to the vertical cylinder arrangement. There is also a minor improvement to the Veed fuel system, and it was reflected in Clessy's first diesel fuel system patent. These engines were used in some Gulf Coast shrimp boats. they were doing fairly well until it became apparent that they had a tendency to throw crankshaft counterweights. That, of course, was not well received. And so, as it turns out, the total volume of these is very small. There were only 21 of these built, and only 2 are known to exist today. In 1924, the company started production of the Model F, and very shortly after that, the Model N. The really unique item about these is that they now have an entirely Cummins homegrown fuel system. We got away from the bead arrangement altogether. You can see this engine is built on a bed plate. The entire cylinder and head, the whole shooting match is bolted to it. So simply by varying the length of the bed plate, you can build this as a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 6-cylinder model. The 4-cylinder that you see right here is 713 cubic inches and generates about 50 horsepower. One of the, what later was determined to be a bit of a problem with these, though, is that all of the valve gear, as you notice up here on top, is exposed. Push rods, rockers, springs, valve stems, the injectors, the whole works up here is exposed. And that proved to be the source of quite the learning experience when these engines were installed in earth-moving shovels manufactured by a Green Bay firm called Northwest Engineering. Things started out looking pretty good, but by the very fact of the nature of its job, this machine puts a tremendous amount of dust and dirt in the air. And that dust and dirt attacked all of those exposed moving parts and wore things out very, very rapidly. We also learned a thing or two about fuel system controls with this application, because it would tend to lug the engine down, and the fuel system would just respond and produce enormous amounts of torque to the point where other components began to break. So although it was not a commercial success, the company did learn quite a bit about diesel engine application with this experience. A much more satisfactory result came from driving a generator with it. And in fact, the U.S. Bureau of Lighthouses standardized on the Cummins F generator here in this arrangement in 1926. And they used it to replace the kerosene burning lamps at all the lighthouses in the United States. That was a very successful arrangement there. Seeking to take some advantage of that learning and do a bit of improvement, in 1926, the Model P came into production. One of the things that you'll know here is that the crankcase now is one solid casting. The camshaft is completely internal. This is the cam drive gear down here, cam follower housings up here. So it's all inside. Still got a lot of all the exposed valve gear and the push rods on top. But this is at least it's getting better. Same displacement and rating as the F and the N, just with these improvements to try to keep dirt and such out. Of the complete models F, P, N, and W series, about 500 of those were built, and 8 are known to exist today. This expression, no diesel can be any better than its fuel system, appeared in a lot of our advertising, although it was later on in the 30s and 40s when it began to be on the advertising. It reflects something that CL recognized from the very beginning, though, and that is that the fuel system was certainly the key to the diesel engine. The original VEED system governed very poorly, particularly on the smaller engines. It had essentially no control whatsoever on injection timing, and really not all that much on fueling quantity either. And so the engine company sought help from VEED from time to time, and VEED sent this fellow, Hans Knudsen, to Columbus to help out. Knudsen was in the United States from his native Denmark. He worked in a design capacity and as a troubleshooter for VEED, and so that's why he happened to be sent to Columbus when Cummins called for help. Klesse liked what he was able to accomplish, and he was soon hired as the Cummins' first chief engineer, and he served in that capacity up until 1948. Interestingly enough, he also did not like to be referred to by his given name. He preferred HL. So we had HL and CL at work now on this task, and between the two of them, in the early 20s, they went through some 3,000 variations on ideas for a cup and injector, trying to come up with the solution that worked best. This slide depicts a handful of Clessy's sketches, although they all featured the cam-driven injector, which was part of the distinctiveness of the Cummins design. Here's another of Clessy's drawings from 1922, where he's finally started to settle in on what we come to know as the Cummins type injector. Here, where the plunger bottoms in the injector cup, and in doing so generates the injection pressure and also controls the end of injection timing. And this was significant because in the early 20s, the rest of the world, insofar as the diesel engine industry went, headed off in the direction of Bosch and L'Orange in pump line nozzle arrangements where all of the injection pressure was developed in the pump, and the injector had a spring-loaded plunger that popped to inject fuel. The Cummins approach, on the other hand, has no need of high-pressure fuel lines, has no need of a moving rack, does not require the complex machining of a helix into the plunger, and does not require matching the performance of each one of the plunger pump assemblies. So it proved to be a lot simpler and really caused the company to stand apart for a great many years. This finally came to complete fruition in 1929 with the single disc fuel system, which is illustrated schematically here with the pump over here generating, drawing fuel from the tank and feeding it at a moderate pressure up here into the distributor system, where with alignment of certain holes, the fuel shot is metered with this little metering plunger, and then distributed back out to the injector where the cam operated plunger generates the injection pressure that is forced into the cylinder. And while all this fuel system work was also going on, there's a great deal of good engineering also underway on all the rest of the engine components as well. And this culminated in 1928 with the introduction of the Model U. One of the key features that you notice just from this photograph alone is that with the exception of the flywheel, there are no longer any external moving parts on this engine. Everything is inside. It's all pressure lubricated. We have multiple cylinders cast into a single crankcase. This thing has replaceable wet liners. It has an electric starter, although it looks like a monster, but it does in fact have an electric starter, and this is one of the first uses of such. And it has the single disc fuel system with the pump that you can see right there. The 4-cylinder that you see here in this photograph is 382 cubic inches and would make about 40 horsepower. And this was displayed at the New York Boat Show in January 1928 and was very well received in marine markets. This, of course, being toward the end of the Roaring 20s. They were banner years for luxury yachts, and a lot of these engines found homes generating either onboard electrical power in some of these boats or even as auxiliary propulsion for sailboats. And so things were really starting finally to look up for the company. And then came the crash. October 29, 1929. And it took a little while to assess how bad it was really going to be. But finally, Mr. Irwin summoned Clessy to come see him on Friday, the 13th of December in 1929. And he pointed out that the Cummins Engine Company had not yet turned so much as a dime's profit in the 10 years of its existence. And then Irwin had prepared all of the paperwork necessary to liquidate the company on 1 January 1930. Well, that was on Friday the 13th. So that gave Clessy the weekend to think about it. And so over the weekend, he came up with a plan. On the following Monday morning, he went to Indianapolis and he bought this 1925 Packard limousine. He brought it back to Columbus. And upon arriving home, he summoned Chief Engineer Knudsen, his younger brother, Don Cummins, and Jay Chambers, who was one of the leading guys in the manufacturing plant there. They removed the Packard gasoline engine out of this car and installed in its place a 4-cylinder Model U. The job was finished on Christmas Eve. That's 1 week. 1 week. You know, bear in mind, of course, these guys could not go to AutoZone and buy anything. Every single piece, part, component, whatever it might have been necessary to completely repower the car had to be designed, fabricated, assembled, and tested on the spot. And that's what they did. On Christmas morning, they started it up and went for a drive. They drove the car to Nashville, Indiana, which is about 20 miles from here and back, and had no trouble with it at all. So Clessy decided to go show it to Mr. Irwin. Now, I want to give you just a little bit of setup about going to see Irwin. Although he had an office in the bank and perhaps even a number of offices around town, it seems that as often as not, when he and Clessy got together to talk business, they did so at the house. So when CO went to call on him on Christmas Day in 1929, he went to the house. This is where Irwin lives. The house and gardens covers an entire city block. The place today is operated as a bed and breakfast, so if you have an opportunity to come and visit us in Columbus, perhaps you can stay here. But in any event, this is the rather imposing sort of sight one sees when you go to call on Irwin. And a little setup as well about the living arrangements there. At this time, Irwin is 63, and he's never married. So having this huge house, he's got kind of a multi-generational extended family kind of thing going on. He has an older sister who was recently widowed, and so she's now living there. And this same sister's youngest daughter and her husband are also living there. So anyway, Clessy arrives and he invites Irwin to go for a ride. Now, he doesn't tell Irwin what he's done. He doesn't mention anything about the engine in the car. He just says, you know, how about come go for a ride with me? Irwin's response was something to the effect, are you completely out of your mind? Mr. Irwin reminded him that his business was essentially gone, that he was in debt up to his ears, that the economic outlook was extremely bleak, and that Irwin thought he was crazy to go and waste money on a new car, and he'd have nothing to do with it. So Clessy was on his way out, and he encountered the widow Sweeney, Irwin's older sister. And she asked what's going on, and Clessy tells her the whole story about what he's done and that he simply wants to surprise Irwin with it. Now, here's one of the great parts of our history that's lost, because she says, let me go talk to him. We have no idea what she said to him, but in 15 to 20 minutes, Irwin comes out of the house, gets in the car, and away they go. Clessy has determined to go out to Nashville and back again. It worked fine that morning, no reason why it shouldn't now, right? But strangely enough, on this trip, they get about halfway out to Nashville and the engine overheats. So Clessy stops, gets out, throws up the hood, and looks for an obvious problem. Not seeing one, there's really not much of anything he can do but wait it out, give it some time to cool off, and then head back for Columbus. Irwin, meanwhile, is also overheated. He's sitting in the car waiting. He has other things to do. He didn't want to be here to begin with. And so finally he's had enough, and he gets out of the car and comes around, and standing there with the hood up, he notes that the words Cummins Engine Company are cast into the handhold covers of the engine that sits in this car. And he says to Cummins, what's one of our engines doing in this car? And he says in his autobiography that he realized that at that very moment something had changed. Because for the 10 years prior, every time Irwin had had any discussion with him about the product, it was always your engine. Cummins, can your engine do that? Cummins, can your engine do that? Cummins, why don't your engines make any money? But on Christmas Day in 1929, it became our engine. The conventional wisdom at the time, of course, was that you cannot put a diesel in an automobile. It's too heavy, it's too slow. Well, here CL has proved that it can be done. And Irwin was so enthused about the notion of the diesel engine as an automotive power plant that they spent much of the rest of Christmas Day planning for the future, and all notions of liquidating the company were discarded. CL realized that some market enthusiasm needed to be generated for this. To got to get the word out about what we've managed to do here. So in January, he drives the car to the New York Auto Show. That again is something of a feat in and of itself, given the conditions of the roads in 1930, and given the fact that it was the middle of the winter. He encountered a great deal of frozen mud, so the story goes. But in any event, successfully arrived in New York. The car averaged 32 miles an hour for the whole trip and pulled down 26 miles to the gallon. He wasn't a registered participant because this was kind of a last minute sort of thing. So he simply parked the car right in front of the show venue where everybody came and went, and put up the hood, sat there with it, talked about it, answered questions, and generated quite a bit of interest and publicity for it. Coming back to Columbus then, within just a couple of months, he acquired this Packard Roadster, pulled the Model U out of the limousine and put it in this Roadster, and then went to Daytona Beach and set the American Automobile Association record for speed for diesel-powered passenger cars at 80 miles an hour. Please note that this was not the kind of thing one might expect out of a sort of a racing operation today. The car was not trailered down there. It was not put on a train. It was driven from Columbus to Daytona, set the record on the beach, and then driven home. A little bit later in 1930, Clessy got with his acquaintances Fred and Augie Duesenberg and secured their assistance in getting an A model Duesenberg and engineering the four-cylinder Model U into that car, such that in February of 1931, he was in position to drive to Daytona again and this time increase the record for diesel-powered automobiles, this time bringing that figure up to 100 miles an hour. And then upon returning from Daytona, began preparations to run in the 1931 Indy 500. The car qualified at 97 miles an hour, which put it pretty much right in the middle of the field. You see, he started 17th and actually moved up some during the course of the race, finishing 13th. But the real distinction of the car's performance in this race was that it did the entire trip nonstop. There was no stopping to take on fuel, no stopping to change tires, none of that business of any sort. The 1931 Cummins diesel Duesenberg was the first car to ever run the Indy 500 nonstop. There have been 2 or 3 that have done it in a few years thereafter, but the 31 Cummins car was the first. It burned about 31 gallons of fuel during the race, and afterward they drove back home to Columbus. And then later the next week drove out to St. Louis to visit a customer, and only then did they top up the fuel in the car. This same car was driven quite regularly in the years that followed to visit customers, to go to various technical conferences and the like. It was also taken to Europe in 1932, and Clessy and Irwin had quite a long tour driving the car throughout Europe. It had also seemed wise to look into the truck market as well. So also in 1931, a little bit later in the year, the company acquired an Indiana truck and put a four-cylinder Model U in it, and then did a coast-to-coast run going from New York to Los Angeles in 97 hours running time. They hauled the Duesenberg race car with them. If you look right here at the back of the box body, you can see just a little bit of the car sticking out. That way they had some respectable load to be carried in the truck, and also it gave them some to cruise around in when they got to Los Angeles. Having done all of this work with the Model U, we refer today to the U as the engine that saved the company. The problem was, though, that it had generated a market, but it was not capable of really fulfilling that market need. It was not really a truck engine. It didn't have enough power. Its layout was wrong. I mean, it was originally really intended for marine service. So throughout 1931, CL and HL are hard at work coming up with an engine that can actually power this market that they have generated. And that was the Model H. A great granddaddy of the N14, of course, a quick glance, and you can see the N14 in it. The H was actually borrowed from a Continental gasoline engine design that never went to production. But the first prototype was built, started, and ran here in Columbus on November 19th, 1931, rated at 125 horsepower, featuring a single disc fuel pump, 2 valve heads that spanned 2 cylinders each, and with a displacement of 672 cubic inches. Feeling the need yet again for yet another spectacular event that would demonstrate the reliability of the engine, They then put it in the Indiana truck that had made the coast-to-coast trip just a little bit earlier in the year, and went up to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and engaged in a nonstop run of 14,600 miles. It took about 2 weeks to knock this out. They finished the day after Christmas and averaged about 43 miles an hour on the trip. There were 3 men that rotated the driving duties. Of course, CL, he's right here. The fellow next to him is Ford Moyer. This is Dave Evans, who had also driven the 1931 race car. And the 3 of them rotated the duty of driving. And then this other photograph down here shows how various necessities, food and the like, were transferred to the truck during the 2 weeks. They'd come down to a somewhat lower speed and have a passenger car run up alongside of them and hand things back and forth. That sets us up for 1932. And although there's a great deal of interest in the truck market now and having the Cummins diesel installed, the truck makers are not quite on board yet. So Cummins decides to push the market a little bit and secured a white and got it delivered to Columbus with no engine in it. Then a 6-cylinder Model H was installed in the truck here in Columbus. And then it was driven to California and placed into service in May of that year. This picture was made right here in Columbus shortly before they departed. The fellow in the white coveralls, is Jay Chambers. You may remember his name from the Great Packard Repower a little while back. He was a key player in many of these various events. The fellow standing next to him is called Clyde Tatman, and he's the man that drove this truck from Indiana to California, having never operated a heavy-duty truck in his life. That also was intentional, plus he wanted someone who could conceivably abuse the vehicle without even knowing it to get it to the West Coast and again help to improve its durability. It went into service in May, and then 4 other whites were also prepared and delivered to Purity stores out in San Francisco by the same mechanism in the months that followed. And then very shortly after that, the market finally stirred to life, and we began to sell the Model H to various truck makers. We sold 10 to Indiana, 5 to Gottfredson, 2 to Nelson Lamoon, 6 to Sterling. 3 of these we know went to Valley Freight Lines, operating out of Fresno. They went from San Francisco to Los Angeles via the Central Valley route over the Grapevine. 2 to Lynn that went into half tracks, we think, and 1 to Kleber. This was just throughout 1932, and then in 33 the business picked up to somewhat larger numbers. Clessy also wanted to demonstrate the utility of the H in the bus market and made one more coast-to-coast trip in 1932 in this Mack, which was repowered with a 6-cylinder H. Running time on this trip was 78 hours, which was noted as being faster than what you could make the trip by the express passenger trains that were available at the time. The engine delivered 9 miles to the gallon on the trip, and I imagine that the onboard accommodations were a little bit better than they were in the Indiana truck. There was also a 4-cylinder version of the H. Of course, it followed very hard on the heels of the 6-cylinder, and these appeared in the 1934 Indianapolis 500. Reason for the 2 was that at the time there was a great deal of talk in the diesel engine industry about 2-stroke technology, and Clessy thought it was worth a look and decided 2 engines that were otherwise identical, except for one operating 4-stroke and one operating 2-stroke. That would be an interesting way to prove that out. So they did so again with a pair of Duesenbergs in 1934. The 2-stroke car finished the race. The 4-stroke car did not, but that was owing to a transmission problem. And at the end of the race, the condition of the 2-stroke engine was quite bad. And so Clessy determined that it certainly didn't appear to offer any great advantage, and the company has not fooled a 2-stroke ever since. That number 5 car that had the 2-stroke engine in it was then stretched in order to accommodate the 6-cylinder H. And in March of 1935, that car was taken down to Daytona Beach, where it once again upped the record for diesel-powered automobiles to 137 miles an hour. The fellow at the wheel in this case is a man by the name of Bill Cummins, and his association with this car set off a confusion about names that lingers with us yet to this day. The engine that's in that car is the oldest known surviving six-cylinder H in the world. The next oldest is in a 29 Sterling that was at Reno last year. The engine in the other car was the oldest known surviving four-cylinder H for many years, but at one point its block cracked due to freezing, and it had to be replaced with another one. And so now the oldest known four-cylinder H, again, that we're aware of, is in a 29 Mac that I believe is somewhere up in the Northeast. Well, all of this racing and initial forays into the truck market drove some improvements in the design very quickly. In 1935, we increased the size of the crank journals from 3 1/4 to 4 1/2 inch diameter, where they then stayed forever. And with that change, the rating was bumped up to 150 horsepower. And in 1937, the company began to offer supercharging on the H, yielding a 200 horsepower. Initially in 37, the blowers were belt driven, and by 42, we had a gear driven arrangement for enhanced reliability. And this is what the performance of those two engines look like. If you compare them against modern day product, this is a typical kind of torque curve of a current day X12 500. And then this blue curve down here is the naturally aspirated six-cylinder H, the 150. And this orange colored curve is the 200 horsepower blown six-cylinder H. Owing to all of his experience with passenger cars, and especially with the Duesenberg brothers, Klesse also had one more shot at the passenger car market and set up a collaborative effort in 1934 with Auburn Cord Duesenberg. The intent was to put diesels in Auburns, and the engine that was designed and developed for this program became known as the Model A. Inline six of 331 cubic inches, rated at 100 horsepower. Again, also having the single disc fuel system and a single slab head of a two-valve design. Once again, a demonstration was needed, and so one of these engines was put into an Auburn convertible, and Klesse drove it coast to coast. In June of 1935, the car delivered 34 miles to the gallon on the trip. It was driven in a much more leisurely fashion than any of Klesse's other coast-to-coast trips, and he made a variety of interesting stops on the way. That picture on the right, yes, that is Hoover Dam, which was under construction at the time, and the Cummins-powered Auburn was not only driven across the top of the dam, but then also down here on the dry riverbed below it. The unfortunate thing, of course, about this program is that in 1937, Auburn Cord Duesenberg ceased operation due to bankruptcy or something similar, I think. And so that maroon convertible became Klesse's personal car for a while, although he had an accident with it in Madison, Indiana. If you're ever in town visiting and are interested, I can show you the exact spot where it happened. So the engine was pulled out of it and put into this 1936 four-door sedan, which is another of the 2 or 3 Auburns that were part of the program. That car survives yet to this day. And it, along with another one, were used by Klesse as his personal grocery getter. CL had taken ill by 1938 with an inner ear disorder, 50 years of age at the time, and as was not unusual then, his doctor recommended that he find a warmer climate and get some rest. And so he elected to go to Florida and considered taking the Auburn down there, but decided he wanted something a little bit different. So he bought a 1936 Cadillac and removed the Cadillac V12 from it and put a production big bore Model A in it. We'd made a minor change to the design of the A as the Auburn program is going on. So this engine is 377 cubic inches, also rated 100 horsepower. And in November 1938, Klesse drove this car to Fort Myers, Florida, and that's where he wintered for a few years before eventually leaving the Columbus area altogether for the West Coast. Long story about how it happened to get back to us. But that car also survives and is in possession of the company yet today. So that kind of brings us to where we have these two principal engine lines in production toward the end of the 30s. The A then produced later on the J throughout the 50s and 60s, and the C series. This was the much older C series throughout the 60s and early 70s. The H, of course, bequeathed this enormous family that eventually led to the N14. Here in the 743 branch, that's where the NH220, the 2.6 bits, a whole variety of engines with iron lungs all live on that branch. And then up here with the 855 that eventually led to the Formula, the Big Cam series, and ultimately the N14. I want to mention before we wrap up here that there are 4 books published on the history of Cummins Engine Company if you're interested in further study or reading. The first one there is Klessy's autobiography. That thing is long since out of print, and they are hard to find. And if you do find one, they usually change hands for a pretty substantial sum. But there are some out there, and they can be found. The Engine That Could is a history of the company's first 75 years that was published by the Harvard Business School in 1997. It is also out of print, although a few can be found from time to time. The Diesel Odyssey of Klessy Cummins is a biography of CL by his youngest son, Lyle. It is an absolutely terrific work, and we have those available in our power store here in Columbus. And then Red, Black, and Global is an update to the Harvard book, and it covers roughly the last 10 years, covers roughly the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s. It was published in-house here at Cummins, and we have lots of those. But in any event, that wraps it up for today. Once again, my thanks to ATHS for this opportunity, for all the enthusiasm that you all directed toward us last year. And again, I hope we can do some great things in Virginia in 2021. Thanks once again.
Thank you, Keith. That was wonderful. I know you have so much history over there. I've seen quite a few of your presentations over the years, and this just amazes me that you guys have all of that in your heads. Do you have any questions? Anybody have anything? Want to raise your hand? Maybe write it in the question and answer box. Yeah, I think, Keith, we got a couple of those books in the ATHS library as well.
Yeah, I should.
Donated a couple of those books to us.
Yep. I don't recall right off the top of my head. I know I shipped some to you out last year. I should mention, while this picture's on the screen without explanation, that's all 5 of the Cummins diesel-powered Indy 500 race cars. And last spring at the Indy 500, we operated all 5 of them on a lap on race day morning.
Oh, that's awesome.
It is the only time that all 5 of them have ever operated together. And it was, man, I tell you what, that was a heck of a treat. And as I mentioned earlier, there are about a dozen guys that make our history and restoration center go. And they did all the work to make this happen. And it was just a phenomenal thing to see. But, and anyway, this particular picture was taken on Carburation Day, which I think is like the Thursday before the race. And big thunderstorm moved through in the afternoon, which is, see the asphalt is just soaked there. But it kind of enhanced the picture because they all have the reflection there in the pavement. But awesome. that was very, very cool. And,
heck yeah, I can imagine.
Where that picture comes from.
All right, John, you had a question. Go ahead and unmute yourself. John,
can you hear me?
Yep.
Keith, John Venata here. I have an interesting anecdote, I guess. My dad told the story for years. You talked about the H models going into the original trucks, and Lynn was, I think you said there was a couple of them that went into those. He told it as it happened in 31. You said they went in 32, so it was probably the end of 31 there or something or other when it happened. But He grew up in New York State along the Delaware River, along the mountains of the Delaware there, and they were building Route 97 from Port Jervis to Binghamton along New York, up along the river there. And the contractor was O.P. Williams, and he had a flock of lins that they used to build that because of the terrain was so bad. It was the only thing they could use working in there in the bad weather and stuff. And he recalls when they unloaded that lin for testing with one of those engines in it, and everybody stood around the thing, including him, when they raised the hood and looked at the Cummins engine in it. And O.P. Williams, as a contractor, received at least one of those to test it at that time building that road. So anyway, that's, I don't know if you knew where they went or anything, but it is an interesting anecdote, I think, that does tell you at least where they tested the one of those. Yeah,
absolutely. That's a terrific story. The only thing we know about those two that went to Lynn in 1932 is that they were eventually sold to some municipal agency in the state of New York. That's the only thing we know about those two. But yeah, there's certainly, and those figures I cited were only 1932 production. Certainly, once you get into years after, the numbers get a lot bigger. I haven't attempted to plow through all of the build records for years later on, but I did spend a couple of days one time going through everything from 1932. Yeah, that's terrific. There are other accounts of the Cummins diesel at work in various road building things, and I was not aware of that one. So thanks much.
That was one of his favorite stories. He said they raised the hood and they all stood around and oohed and awed and said, "That's a Cummins diesel."
Yeah,
he remembered that for years. Okay, thanks.
That's pretty cool.
Thanks, John. Anyone else have a question for Keith? We can try and stump him. I'm not sure it's possible. We can try. Clayton said, "Thank you, Keith. You had another great presentation." So, all right, Delmar, go ahead and unmute yourself. Delmar, you'll have to unmute yourself, Delmar. There you go.
Okay, thanks for the presentation, but I know when you was talking about the earlier engines in the 30s that you installed it in a Godfredson. Well, Bob Godfredson also owned Trans-American Truck Lines and went with the Cummins early on, but his personal car, he put one of the engines in a Packard.
Yeah.
So, good story. I like it. Good engine.
Any idea if that car yet survives?
I don't have any idea.
Okay. That's one of the, of these various vehicles that Clessy did all this promotional work with back in the 30s. The Packard limousine is long lost. But man, what a find it would be if we could ever turn that up, or even something very similar to it.
Yeah, there's probably members of the Godfredson family still living.
Yeah. Wow.
That's awesome. Thank you, Delmar.
You're welcome.
All right, Stan asked, what happened to the A family line of engines?
Well, if I go back up, just right here to this part of our family tree, the original A was very short-lived, but then the big bore version, the 377 6-cylinder, was built up until about 1954. There were a handful of them that appeared in heavy-duty trucks, although, as you can well imagine, 100 horsepower rating, even back in the 40s, was really not much, but there were a few. An awful lot of them wound up being onboard electrical power generators in warships during World War II. But then it was eclipsed by the introduction of the J in 1950, and that's why we discontinued production then in 1954. But A's would have had, since the passenger car market didn't work out, an engine that small wound up being again more something used to drive a generator. It might have driven water pumps, some other small industrial sort of applications.
Thank you.
and the one that sits in the ATHS lobby.
I was going to just say, we use that as a talking place every once in a while. The staff does. We tend to gather around the Cummins engines.
Yeah, everybody meet at the A, right?
Yeah, we meet at the A. So if anybody wants to come see one of the A's, it is sitting in the ATHS lobby, gratefully donated by Cummins and restored by Mark Shore. Ken Kraus, go ahead and unmute yourself. Go ahead, Ken.
Keith, this was a fantastic presentation and early history on the Christmas Day meeting between Mr. Cummins and Mr. Irwin was really a good Christmas present for everybody, it sounds like. And thank you very much.
Yeah, it certainly was. You know, like a lot of the stories of history of almost anything, there are those very small handful of turning points. And one of the interesting things about some of ours is that there were all these men engaged in this work, and then every now and again a woman steps in. One such is Clessie's mother, who suggested that he talk to W.G. Irwin. You know, had that not happened, probably none of us would be talking about this today. And then another, of course, is the widow Sweeney, who persuaded Irwin to come out and ride in the car. Fascinating turning points. But yeah, to have been a fly on the wall there in the Irwin house on Christmas Day in 1929 would be quite the thing.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. All right, just a few more minutes if anybody has any other questions or comments or stories. We love those. And Keith, again, we can't thank you enough. You guys have been amazing partners, and we just love having you with us. And hopefully we'll get to see you in person next year.
Well, yeah, that's I'm certainly looking forward to it. You know, I've mentioned pretty much every time I've done one of these talks that I can keep going until everybody is blue in the face, and I've got a couple of, but it's only because the source material is so good. You know, I didn't make up any of this. Moon is just repeating what happened, and it's such a remarkable tale from end to end. But I've got a handful of ideas for the Virginia event in 2021, and I certainly hope we can make them all come to pass.
We look forward to it. All right, everyone. Thank you all for attending all of our presentations, and thank you, Keith, for wrapping us up in such great style. And don't forget to go look at all of the trucks and various things on the virtual truck show. There's a couple of Cummins ones in there, the fire truck, which I remember being in Lexington, which was amazing, and the first pickup. Is awesome in there. So thank you, and we appreciate it, and we will catch you all later.
Thanks, Leanne.
Bye, Keith.